Welcome into another edition of the FutureSox RoundUp. My name is Elijah Evans, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Jeff Cohen. Today we are back with a little bit of a different episode. Typically we're talking about the prospects and all of that such stuff, but today, the baseball season's over. It's November 1st as we record today. The World Series wrapped up last night, and now we are heading into the offseason. And the offseason for a team that was just the worst in MLB history is a lot more exciting than the actual season was, frankly. And we started off the offseason with, the day before the World Series ended, it was announced that the White Sox have found their new manager. So we're in a situation now where we are entering the offseason with a manager in place, a coaching staff that is expected to be announced here in the next week or two, and then a lot of things to figure out with this roster. But the first step of the offseason was finding a manager. So this week, Jeff, Will Venable announced as the manager for the White Sox. It seemed like for about a week or so that he was one of, if not the top candidates. And, there was a lot of speculation of, is he even going to take the job, right? He declined to do an interview with the Mets last year for a head coaching job. I think people had speculated he was kind of waiting out as an assistant in Texas until Bruce Bochy retired. That was kind of the thought a lot of people had. But here we are. And Chris Getz, pulled him in, and he seems to really buy the vision that Getz is kind of setting up. And I'm really excited. So what was your initial thoughts from the White Sox finding their manager?
Elijah, I've got two immediate thoughts. And the first is that he seems really highly regarded in the industry. That just seems to be the consensus. But the second thing is, you're right, he's turned down other head coaching jobs. But he didn't turn this one down despite the disaster it looks like the White Sox appear from the outside. So maybe, he sees all the young players, he sees the potential for success sooner than later. So to me, that's very encouraging, because had he said, I don't want any part of that, that would have not bode well for the immediate future for the White Sox, I think.
I agree with you. I think it's exciting. I think as he seems like someone who's been a candidate for a few years now for a head coaching job, even though he's young. I like that he's young. I like that he's new in kind of the world of coaching, right? He was a player for 10 years. He's been a coach now for 6 years. This is a guy who was a Princeton two-sport athlete, right? Like, he's got a lot of really good, he checks the boxes, right? And I refuse to let myself get too excited over a manager because of the past few, right? And I think, we liked Griffol's interview initially, his press conference when he got hired, and obviously that has not gone a very good direction, right? So it's like, I hope that it is a generally positive sign. And I think it's like, we'll see what happens, right? I don't want to get too excited, but the reality is that he was a top choice and he wanted to come to Chicago and agreed to a deal. And if anything, that's a good sign to see that they were able to get a deal done with someone that they really want to be in this position.
Right. I agree. And, I wonder, do you think it's part of a new trend of hiring guys, up and coming guys who are haven't necessarily been managers before? We're not just going to all the retreads over and over and over again.
Right. I hope so. I think that's good for baseball. I think it's good for the sport. I think it's good for a lot of elements of it, right? So it's like, I hope that's the case. I don't know if I believe it is yet around the whole league, but I think the White Sox are doing it. And I think Chris Getz is a young GM and he's going with a young coach. And I think let's lean into this, right? The team is young. The team is going to be really young for a few years. So let's lean into the new era. Let's get, modernize this team, right? It's been overdue that they've, fallen in finally to some analytics and some modern game theory, or, just strategy of the game. Like, that's changed over time. And I think it's about time this team and this organization catches up, frankly. So I'm excited. I think it's going to be a new era. I think that it's going to be really interesting to see how the coaching staff shakes out. And that's one thing I want to get into for everyone listening. We're going to get into free agent targets today. That's going to be our main topic of the day, is going to be diving into, where are the positions that are going to be filled by young guys, and then where are these other positions that we have specific guys who can fill some veteran holes, some guys that can flip, right? But before that, the coaching staff is going to be really interesting, Jeff, because there's rumors that Grady Sizemore is a good chance he'll be back in the staff at some capacity. It seems like there's a lot of people speculating, Getz said there'll be some familiar faces, right? So I hope so, right? Like, Grady, I think that Venable was a more ready coach to be a manager. And I think it's very clear that he had a better resume in terms of being a manager than Sizemore did. At the same time, the young guys really like Grady. He was there at the end of the season. He sparked a little bit of energy, right? Like, I'm not saying, I don't think he was ready to be a manager. And I'm really glad they didn't just go with the easy in-house option. But I do think it'd be great to have him back as a bench coach for this team, like he was this past year, right? As an assistant, the head bench coach potentially, or even, the outfielders coach, whatever capacity it is. I think having him as an associate on the bench would be really good for the organization.
Yeah, if he doesn't mind sliding over one seat and being number 2 instead of number 1, I think he'd definitely be an asset for sure.
Yeah.
I'm curious, though, as we're thinking about the coaching staff, do they retain Jersh as third base coach, or is he back in the minor leagues? And Chris Johnson
Right.
as assistant hitting coach. A lot of
And then, yeah, I'm even curious about Ethan Katz too, because Ethan Katz
yeah,
is the one guy that was a holdover. He was a holdover in the Grifol staff, right? So he stayed as the pitching coach. A lot of the pitching staff had stayed from the previous regime, from the La Russa era into the Grifol era. I like a lot of what Ethan Katz has done, but I'm not sure it's a sure thing. Honestly, I think there's a chance that Venable brings in a pretty new staff, right? So I think the hitting coach, I mean, the hitting side of things is definitely going to be new. That was already kind of announced that they were going to move on a lot of the hitting side, right? So I think you're going to see a new hitting coach. You're going to see a new assistant hitting coach probably. I think it's going to be interesting to see. I think, Sergio Santos could be up. There's a possibility if they decide to move on from Katz, that Santos could be considered. Jersh could be considered as one of the, potential base coaches, right? So the staff is going to be fascinating, but I do think there's something to be said for keeping at least, one or two guys that have been working with a lot of these minor league prospects, right? I think it'd be nice to have a Grady or a Jersh or a Santos there who can be kind of that liaison for these young guys that have gotten to, develop the last year or two, for a guy coming in Venable who doesn't know any of these guys quite yet and is going to be trying to develop this next core.
right. I guess one of the $1,000,000 questions is just the relationship between Bannister and Katz, right?
Right.
I would imagine even less so than Venable, it's Bannister's call.
Yeah, that's also a good point about the pitching side. I think that it could be, definitely partly Bannister's call as well. So we'll see what happens. But I think it's interesting. I like the hire. It was the hire I wanted. It's the hire James Fox wanted. I mean, I think a lot of the people in our White Sox world had said this was kind of one of the ideal guys, right? I think he makes a lot of sense. He checks the boxes. Let's see it in reality, right? We got to prove it. We got to see it. But it does seem like it was a very good hire, and I'm excited that the White Sox were able to get a hire done like this because they've gone the easy route 3 times in a row. And it's nice to see them not go the easy route and do a full search and get someone that is not tied to the organization and is a fresh new face that is not in this whole bubble of Royals, White Sox, Tony La Russa, et cetera, right? Like, this is a real coaching search and a hire that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we're all exhausted from that other world. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So exciting stuff going into the offseason, heading into November with a manager, soon to have a coaching staff, I'm sure, is really exciting. I'm happy to see this, but there's a lot of work to be done on the roster side of things, right? Like, there is a ton to do with this roster before we can say, like, oh, 2025 is going to be fun. And I do think 2025 is going to be fun. I really do believe that. I think we both believe that there's going to be a lot of excitement in watching young players be the priority, right? But at the same time, like, there's some stuff to do. There's a lot of work to do, and it's going to take some time this offseason of really honing in and figuring out what this roster is going to look like. And that starts with establishing who are you going into the season feeling confident is going to be on this roster. So I want to go through positions real quick before we dive into our free agent targets, because next week we're going to do, or next week or maybe the week after, I think in 2 weeks we're probably going to do trade targets, right? Which is a crochet trade, all that stuff, right? But in terms of who is there right now, I think the pitching needs very little help, right? I think if you trade Crochet, I do believe they're going to sign one pitcher because I don't think they're going to go into the season with 5 essentially rookie starters. I know Cannon's not a rookie and he passed eligibility. I think Thorpe passes eligibility too, but Burke's still rookie eligible. It's Mason Adams going to be rookie eligible. Kai Busch is going to be rookie eligible. Eventually Noah Schultz, et cetera, right? Like, it's going to be a lot of young pitchers and we want that. I do think there's room for one additional starting pitcher likely, and someone potentially that could be flipped to the deadline if all those other guys are ready, right? If Noah's knocking on the door and Hagen's knocking on the door come, July, right? You can flip that veteran pitcher. But I do think they're going to sign one veteran starter, in my opinion.
Yeah, and there's a ton of choices out there depending upon how much they want to throw at it.
Yeah.
You can go on the less expensive end of the spectrum and get Chris Flexen, or you can go up a few notches and get right. You can get someone who like Kurt, what's his name, Kyle Gibson, or one of those guys.
That was like last year, yeah.
Yeah,
so let's go through I'm going to go through the roster first, I think, and then we'll dive into specific targets because I did come with a list. I sent you a list of a bunch of targets because I think the free agent class is interesting this year. There's obviously Juan Soto is going to get Juan Soto, Corbin Burns are going to get the high level attention, right? That's not in the White Sox ballpark, right? And then there's a ton of middle. It's an interesting class. There's a few superstars, a lot of pretty good players, but there's a lot of variability in that pretty good category. And then there's the category of value gets that a lot of those gets the White Sox get are going to be the value guys, the veterans, the guys that underperformed last year, right? Like, that's how it's going to go. Pitching side, though, I think it's one starting pitcher at most, and I think it's a starting pitcher that you're hoping to be able to flip at the deadline ultimately. or someone that could slide to the bullpen if needed, if you have so many young starters that are performing well, right? So I think that's the starting side. Bullpen side, like we talked about this before we just started recording, like I really hope this isn't just a bullpen of a bunch of veteran 1-year deals that you're trying to flip. There's a lot of good relievers in this system, and we have harped on this so much all season, Jeff, but like I hope that it's 1, maybe 2 veteran signings in the bullpen and a few guys that can stabilize, but allow the majority of the bullpen to be Jordan Leisure, Eric Adler, Anthony Hoopy to Natoa, who else is just every single one of those guys, right? Peyton Pallette eventually, Addison Coffey, Trey Mago, right? Like the list goes on and on. There is at least 10 guys that you could stick in the bullpen and deserve MLB innings, at least to see. I mean, Frazier Ellard and Prelander Baroa were great at the end of the season.
Yeah,
those guys need to be in the bullpen already. So it's like, I hope that it's 1, maybe 2 veteran relievers. That's my opinion, at least. And I know it probably will be more than that, at least at enter camp, because you can kind of harbor some of those guys and not put them on the 40-man yet for some of those young pitchers, right? Which is dumb. I mean, this team's going to not be good anyways. You might as well just let these guys play. I hope it's 1 or 2 relievers, and that's it.
No, yeah, and I'm cautiously optimistic that they're not going to load up like last year. That this is the year to find out what they have on the arms. It's got to be. It's got to be.
And they trust their pitching, right? Like the pitching development is so clearly in a very good place. Let that shine and let that be the priority, because it should be at this point, right?
Yeah.
So then on the offensive side, we'll get back to these targets in a little. We'll circle back to the pitching. But on the offensive side, the big question for me is first base right now, because is Andrew Vaughn staying, right? I think Gavin Sheets is all but gone. I'd be really surprised if they tender Gavin Sheets' contract. I think it's just, you've seen it for 3 years. It's the exact same profile. He didn't even really hit for much power this year. It's a high swinging lefty with a ton of strikeouts who can get stuck in right field, but shouldn't be, and whatever. I think the Sheets thing is over. And I think the question is Vaughn, right? Are they willing to admit they screwed up in developing Andrew Vaughn? Because I don't think Andrew Vaughn is a bad player, and I'm not even sure that I wouldn't be shocked if he figures out how to be a major league average first baseman, for the future, right? But the reality is, at a premium offensive position, Andrew Vaughn has not been good enough for 3 years and for 4 years, right? And it sucks because he never had minor league time, and he was thrown into the whole COVID training site and off alternate and whatever. It really screwed him up, I think, and I don't think it's necessarily fair to him to just call him a bust, which a lot of people love to do. But at the same time, like, I don't think he's lived up to what you need from him. Is it worth paying him to stick around, or is it worth just saying, you know what, sorry, we messed this one up, we're going to just move on from, the last of, I don't know if you saw this tweet of mine, but now that they declined Moncada's option, they're the only 2 players left from the 2021 season that started the team on the roster were Vaughn and Robert. If they move on from Vaughn, it's just Robert. I kind of think it's just time, but I don't know. I'm still not sure if they're gonna pull the trigger, and I'm not sure they have the guts to pull the trigger, to be honest.
With Sheets, I think he actually has 1 minor league option left. So
he might actually.
They might actually just say, let's keep him just in case. The reason I kind of think they may keep Vaughn around 1 more year is I'm not sure who in the minor leagues or on the roster is ready to step in and replace him. Now, you're right. We're going to talk about some free agent first baseman. And if they go that route, then definitely I think he's gone. But if they don't want to spend money on Rhys Hoskins or something, they may just go with him 1 more year.
There's the Tim Elko conversation, though, too. I mean, you could just platoon. I mean, you could give Elko, you could at least say, here, Elko's hitting pretty well in the Arizona Fall League. And I know we keep saying, like, it doesn't make sense. He shouldn't be able to sustain the way he hits with a 30-something% strikeout rate, and he keeps doing it. So he does it, he did it in Charlotte, and he's doing it in Arizona in the Fall League right now. So, I think we could see an Elko Vaughn platoon if they're not ready to pull the trigger on Vaughn yet, right? If they want to give Elko some at-bats, put Elko in against lefties and see what happens. He mashes lefties, give him 2 games a week where he can hit, or let him play DH a few days, or Vaughn can DH a few days, and Elko can play first, whatever it is, right? So we'll see. But I do think it is a viable possibility that they add a first baseman. In the infield, you want the dream scenario is you've got Brooks and you've got Colson and you've got Vargas and you've got Ramos, and the 4 of those guys can make up the 3 infield spots and make it happen. However, the defensive shifts, if it ends up being Colson shifting to short to third, Brooks goes to short, or Colson, they start at shortstop, they go Ramos at third, whatever the defensive arrangement is, the dream scenario is those 4 guys are your 3 left side, your 3 main infielders aside from first base, right? That is the ideal situation. Is that going to happen to start the season? don't think so. In which case, I think there's a need for a utility infielder. That's what I listed the position as when we go into free agents, right? I don't think it's, you need to sign a shortstop. I don't think it's like Paul DeYoung where you need to say, hey, this guy's just going to be our shortstop for 3 months until hopefully Colson's ready, because he wasn't, and he didn't end up being ready last year, right? When that was the plan, basically, was just fill the roster with DeYoung, have Colson take over in July. I think you sign a veteran utility infield guy that can move around. You can let those 4 guys figure out the positioning throughout the season while having a veteran there that's capable of playing at least 2 of those 3 spots.
Elijah, do you know if Nicky Lopez is still on the roster?
Oof, he is, I believe. I
Yeah,
think he's in his last year of arbitration. It's got to be that's a non-tender for sure. I don't see any way. I mean, maybe just for the vibes, maybe, but I'd have a hard time seeing how you justify keeping him, considering it's defensive value, but I'm not sure I can see that. I mean, $4.3 million last year, free agent going into, free agent after 2025. So he does have 1 more year of his contract. And it's arbitration, right? So it's going to be probably, at least 4.5 million, right? There's no chance you pay that I don't see paying that.
But aren't they on the hook for that for 1 more year?
It was a 1-year deal, but it was they signed him when he's still eligible for arbitration. So you could non-tender him in the offseason and just pay the buyout, essentially, right. I think.
Yeah. Because I was going to say, if they're on the hook for $5 million, then there's your utility guy. Yeah.
Right, but I think it's a non-tender case there. So we'll get to it, but I think there's a utility infield spot, and then the last spot we need to talk about is right field, right? I mean, it's clear as day. I think that's the most obvious. Like, you have to sign a decent free agent to play right field for this team, and I think that's not even sure, you might end up trading them, but it's not Oscar Colas right now. I don't think you can give an everyday spot to Dominic Fletcher. He's great defensively, but I don't think you can justify just giving him an everyday starting spot. This team has not had a right fielder, Jeff, since Jermaine Dye, probably, right? It's been that long. It's time. It's time. I don't care. And the guys we're going to talk about are not superstars, but sign someone who is an everyday starting outfielder to play right field, please. It's time. Unless we'll talk about this next week, right? But unless you get the blue chip right field prospect in a crochet trade, right? You got to sign a right fielder. You have to sign someone to play right field that can be a decent outfield trio with Robert and with Benintendi, assuming neither of them get traded.
Yeah. I've got, while we're running down this list, I've got some other guys who are in contention for both the infield and outfield. At least they were last year. And I'm wondering if you expect to see any of them around. And we've got Jolts and Deloach and Amaya, Shoemake, Lenine, Sosa. You see any of those guys coming back in spring?
I think Sosa's the one, maybe, and I think Deloach is maybe the other one. I think Deloach could push for the last bench spot, maybe, and I think Sosa could maybe be a utility infield piece if they don't bring Colson up to start the year. I think Sosa could get a middle infield spot, right? If Colson doesn't make the opening day roster, then I think there's a world where Sosa starts the year with the team. Deloach maybe as the last outfielder on the roster. Jolks, no chance. Shoemake, I don't see. Namaya, I don't really see much value in. I mean, maybe he's the utility infielder, but I don't have a particular reason to have any of those guys on the roster. I just don't think there's enough excitement or upside there to justify any of those guys getting an immediate roster spot, really.
I'm with you. It just makes me nervous that they even give those guys a run along with Nick Senzel.
Right. But last year was also, I'm hoping and really, really hoping this is a new shift this year, because there isn't a reason to do that again. You don't have to be the worst team, and you don't have to make the decisions of continuing to roll out and try guys and just see what happens, right? Allow yourself to let the actual players you're hoping to invest in your future be the focal point, right? And if they're not the focal point initially, okay, let's sign some guys. So let's go through these guys, because it's okay to fill the roster, but these signings need to be intentional, and they need to come with a purpose of they are going to get traded at the deadline because this player is ready to play, or they're going to be a player that can at the very least give us value for the season and be a veteran presence and provide more at a given position than you believe a young guy can right now, right? If you're going to sign a guy to be a starter at any of these spots we just mentioned, they need to be someone that you are confident is going to provide more to this team and or be traded than some of the young guys you currently have, or else it's a waste, or else you should just play the young guys, right? So it's like there has to be some value. And yes, you're not going to get top free agents, but there needs to be a reason for these signings. And that's where I stand with it. And that's why, like, I didn't even mention catcher because I don't want to see a catcher signing. I want Edgar Caro and Corey Lee catching every single game this season. That I see zero reason it should not be those two catching every single game, assuming they're healthy for the White Sox, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And then you got Michael Turner as the guy who's going to be in Charlotte.
Hackenberg's there too if needed. Yeah, for sure.
Before we dive into this, one more question. Not only are we unsure about what they're going to do with Vaughn, but do you see Luis Robert Jr. opening day center field?
I do. I don't think it's likely that they trade him. I think especially considering I do believe that they're going to trade Crochet, that it would be really hard to sell, here's our new coach, here's our new team, but both of these star players are gone now. I think that's a hard pitch, and I think they're going to hold off and try and wait to trade Robert for a year or two potentially, or at least till the deadline at the very least, and open the season with him in center. There's a possibility, and I think some of these right fielders I'm going to mention are guys that could play center if that happens, right? If he gets traded, or if it's a late offseason trade, or if it ends up being a deadline trade, right? Hopefully then some of these guys that are playing right, or Dominic Fletcher potentially, or somebody else they bring in, right, could then slot to center. But I do think he opens the year in center.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough.
All right, so let's do this thing. We'll go back to the pitching side. Starting pitching. I'm going to start you with 5. I've got 6 names and then 2 that are just for fun a little bit. But the main 6 names that I brought is Nick Pivetta of the Red Sox, Jose Quintana, familiar face, White Sox legend Jose Quintana, shout out Jose Quintana, of the Mets, Michael Lorenzen, who bounced around last year, has bounced around a lot the past few years, Matthew Boyd, who was, for those that watched the playoffs, was a really weirdly very good for Cleveland in the playoffs this year as a veteran signing. John Means of the Orioles, who's coming off of another injury-riddled season, which is a bummer because that guy had a lot of talent a few years ago. And then Spencer Turnbull, who was with the Phillies this year, a little bit more of a buy low than some of these other guys. I think these names make a lot of sense. I don't think any of them are aces, right? I think Pivetta is probably your highest end on this list, right? Or maybe Lorenzen. Quintana had a pretty good postseason for the Mets this year, but familiar face, right? Means and Turnbull, a little bit more of a, buy low, see what happens, right? Yeah. I think Matthew Boyd's just a veteran, right? He had a good end of the season, so it's like, oh, maybe he kind of, found some things, right, later in his career more. But I would love to see a Nick Pivetta or a Michael Lorenzen, I think, would be really my goal. I think that's the right range of someone that's going to be a little expensive, right? Those guys are guys that are not going to be worth nothing. They're going to command some money, but it's also somebody that is actually a solid piece to the rotation potentially. And if you can get a pitcher like that on a 2-3 year deal, then you have options and flexibility, because if your pitching is as good as you possibly think it's going to be with the young guys, right, then you can flip that pitcher with a year and a half of control potentially for a decent haul if they have a good first half. Or if some of the younger pitchers take a little bit of time, you could keep that guy in your rotation all year and feel pretty good about it, right?
Yeah, no, I agree. I've got another name for you, though.
Let's hear it.
Shane Bieber.
That's where we were going next, because I was going to say this is the dream scenario. The dream scenario is a Shane Bieber or Walker Buehler, which is not going to happen after the World Series. Now, I wrote this list before the World Series. Walker Buehler was the best version of himself in the World Series and came in on a day's rest to get the save in the last game of the World Series yesterday. He's just a dog. He's someone that I love personally and I'm a huge fan of. And I don't see it happening. I don't see him leaving LA after this. I think the Dodgers will do what it takes to keep him on a 1 or 2 year deal, just because, what just happened in the World Series, right? But Shane Bieber is interesting, Jeff. Familiar with the division. He is going to take a prove-it deal, right? Coming off a surgery, he's going to be a guy that's going to have to sign maybe 1 year with a 1 year player option for the second year type of deal, right? So he's going to be on that prove-it deal. I think the White Sox are going to get priced out on a Bieber just because he has Cy Young upside, but it's fun to think about for sure.
Well, there's a good chance, coming off all these injuries, that he's going to have a low base salary with a ton of incentives.
Right.
And so if that's the case, the White Sox can play in that arena.
Right. So I think it's possible. I think there's some other guys, like an Andrew Heaney that I could see, Alex Cobb maybe. There's Trevor Williams. There's a bunch of, here and there starters that I could see filling it out. But I do think, a Pivetta type who had a lot of strikeouts last year, didn't have the best results, around a 4 ERA, a Lorenzen who's been, bounced around at the deadline the past few years, but is someone who's been a contributor for playoff teams the past few years, right? Like, I think those are guys that if you put those guys at the end of your rotation with all these young guys, you feel okay about it. And you feel like it's someone you could potentially flip as well. I like the idea of Quintana too. I just think it'd be fun. I think Quintana was an awesome guy when he was in Chicago for 7 years or whatever it was. Before that, he brought Dylan Cease and Eloy Jimenez to the White Sox in that trade. So I think it'd be kind of full circle, but I do think because he was pretty solid for the Mets, I think there'll be some contenders that wouldn't mind putting Quintana in their 5 spot, and he might prefer that to being in a rebuilding team,
Yeah. It's interesting question. How much will the White Sox invest in a pitcher,
right.
and do they just get a guy, trying to fill some holes for 1
Right.
year, or that's why a guy like Bieber, if you've got some club options for him for 26 and 27,
Sure.
That's really exciting. All of a sudden, you've got your SP1 locked in with potentially.
Yeah, 100%. That's why I kind of like John Means. I think it's definitely bargain hunting, I would say, because of all the injuries. But
Yeah.
John Means is a guy that he came back for 4 games this year and was really good before he got hurt again. And it's really unfortunate because his injuries have derailed his career to this point. But I mean, he's thrown a total of 10 games now in the past 3 seasons due to injuries.
Ooh.
But I know, brutal for sure. And that would be like a 1 year, $5 million deal with incentives, right? So that wouldn't be anything really. And there's a world where you get a portion of 2021 and 2019 through 2021, John Means, where he had a 3.6 ERA across 3 seasons and was, chugging, being a really solid pitcher for a rebuilding Orioles team at the time. So he's going to get a 1 year prove it deal. I don't hate it. I don't mind the idea. He's a left-hander. The White Sox could use a left-hander, especially if they end up trading, Crochet, right? So I think there's a world where that happens. But generally, I do think one veteran pitcher does make sense just to balance out a little bit of the risk that you have by running out at pretty much all rookie and second-year rotation and pitching staff.
No, and to be honest, I can see a world where the White Sox do take a chance on John Means. I think, unfortunately, someone like Pivetta is going to be too expensive.
Unfortunately, maybe. It's crazy that a 4.1 ERA with 160 strikeouts is too expensive for the White Sox, and that shouldn't be the case. I mean, he's a decent pitcher. He's not a bad pitcher. Don't get me wrong,
Right.
but like that should be very attainable for a team that has no money on the books. But you're probably right, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Going over to the relief side, like we said, I think it's 1 max 2 relievers that you actually need to give major league deals to, because I don't think you need to force that when you have so many guys ready to be out of the bullpen in Charlotte and in Birmingham. I listed a bunch of guys here of guys that are that middle tier, right? I think it'd be nice to get 1 guy you actually feel really good about, right? I think that'd be great to get 1 guy that could be a late inning option, a veteran, could close some games, not put pressure on Baroa, Ellard, Leisure, etc. to have to be the closers, right? I think it's not obviously, Tanner Scott is priced out and Jeff Hoffman those are the elite relievers this year. Even Clay Holmes, Kenley Jansen, even though he's a bit older, right? Like those are the guys that are going to be priced out. The middle tier, though, I think it starts with like a Carlos Estevez, who had a slightly disappointing season, but was a really solid closer last year. Or a Sean Armstrong of the Rays, I think could make sense. Dylan Floro, AJ Minter of the Braves has been consistently a very solid left-hander. Paul Sewald, I actually kind of like the idea of buying low on a Paul Sewald. He's someone who was a closer and a really good one last year, struggled a lot this season with Arizona, but is still could be a nice add. Hector Neris could be a bounce back guy. Hector Neris, Sir Anthony Dominguez, those are both bounce back guys. Jorge Lopez as well. All guys that had down years this past year, but relievers are so volatile and they've all shown to be really impressive pitchers at different points in their career, right? Shintaro Fujinami was another one I threw in there for fun. A Japanese pitcher who came over 2 years ago and really has never found success in his first 2 years in the big leagues. Stuff is good. I think there's a chance that he just finds something with messing around with Bannister maybe. So a lot of names I threw at you there, but I think it's ideally you get 1 of those middle tier relievers that you feel really good about, and then you get 1 guy maybe that's buy low, see what happens type of arm.
Yeah. I think it's a good list. I really like the idea of the Sean Armstrong.
I like that too. Yeah.
And he's, there was a time where he was pretty dominating, and
Yeah.
And Sewald, that's interesting. That's an interesting thought.
It's a flippable, right? I think a lot of these relievers, like relievers in baseball, in my opinion, like I have become very like relievers are really valuable because we've seen more than ever how valuable they are this year in the playoffs. You see the way the teams are approaching games, right? Bullpen usage, right, has been incredibly high this year. It was incredibly high this year in the postseason. I think the highest bullpen usage postseason ever. But they're also so volatile. And I think when you're in the position the White Sox are in, you have to be willing to trade whatever relievers you sign at the deadline if they're performing well. This past year, nobody was performing well, so the only guy you were actually able to trade was a Kopech, who just won a World Series. It's crazy that Michael Kopech's a World Series champion, by the way. But it's you got to be willing to trade these guys, but you do have to sign one or two guys that are veterans. I really like AJ Minter. He's one of all the guys I mentioned. I think he's one of the ones I have circled because his stuff is really good. He's a lefty. The White Sox could use another lefty in the bullpen. And he's someone who I think, as flash stuff that's even better than his results are, right? I think this year his numbers were kind of not quite as indicative to who he is as a pitcher, right? He had a good year, 2.62 ERA this year. Ended up dealing with some injuries as well, but a career 3.2 ERA guy has always been pretty steady for Atlanta for many, many years now. So we'll see what happens. But I do think, signing one guy that you feel good throwing in the 8th and 9th inning, and then one guy that you can buy low on, see what happens. Sir Anthony Dominguez is of the guys I mentioned too, could be fun because he was, at one point he was kind of touted as like a potentially very, very high end reliever a few years ago with Philly, and then got traded this year at the deadline. Never really found his groove with Baltimore, so I could see him being an interesting option there in terms of like upside candidate.
Yeah, I agree with you though about the fungibility of these relievers,
Right.
because it just seems like in baseball, they're like 24 guys that you can count on every year.
If that.
If that. Yeah, Josh Hader, Tanner Scott. I mean, and these guys get the big bucks and they deserve it. And then it seems like the other guys, they're good for a year, they're hurt for a year. They're good for a year, they're ineffective for a year. And you just got to be able to, move them in and out as they meet your needs.
Yeah, 100%. No, I hear you on that. I completely agree with that standpoint. So generally from a pitching side, I think we're in agreement that it's one relief veteran starter probably just to balance out all the young guys because there is so many young starters. And then it's one, maybe two veteran relievers that you feel very comfortable pitching and then flipping immediately if they perform well pretty much.
And as someone who's located here in Charlotte, I'm sure there'll be 2 or 3 other veterans on the nights.
Of course. There will be a lot of guys that get camp deals. There'll be minor league. There'll be spring training invitations, right? But they won't necessarily make the roster. I hope that that bullpen, assuming starting the season with an 8-man bullpen, right, which most teams are doing these days, I really hope that at least 5 of those guys are young upside relievers. If it's at least 5, I will be happy. Even if it's 4, I'll be okay. If it's less than 4 young guys, I will be really frustrated because that doesn't make sense to go into the season with more than half of your bullpen being veterans, given where this team is at right now.
No, absolutely. And given, as you mentioned, some of the guys who really looked good the end of last year and other guys who are looking good in the AFL now.
100%. I mean, Ellard and Baroa looked phenomenal in September. They were one of the best relief duos in September, but they both had an under 2 ERA down the last month of the season. Jordan Leisure finally healthy. I'm excited to see what he can do now that he's healthy. He was hurt most of last year, right? Didn't really get a full taste of the big leagues, right? Adler's been, I posted an Eric Adler tweet yesterday. He's got the best curveball by results in the entire Arizona Fall League this year, and it's not even close. His curveball has been unbelievably devastating. His strikeout rates are great. He's been really good. AHT has been very solid. Peyton Pallette has struggled a little bit and still probably needs a little bit more time, but we saw what he did last year, right? Like, he's not far away. He could easily go on a run and do the same thing this year. Addison Coffey, Trey Mago, both studs in Charlotte all season. When we were visiting Charlotte, we were like, why are these two not up? They've been consistently throwing well for 2 months straight in Charlotte, and they're not even getting a look. These guys need a chance, and they deserve a chance. Going over to the offensive side, let's say the White Sox trade or non-tender Andrew Vaughn. So let's under the assumption that Andrew Vaughn is gone. I still don't really believe that, but assuming that it's Tim Elko as the hopefully get him some innings, but we're going to sign someone to at least start the season as the primary first baseman, with Elko being kind of a secondary first baseman / DH or the backup, or, in Charlotte for another month or two before he ends up coming up. The first baseman I marked down, there's a few big first basemen, right? Christian Walker's a free agent. Pete Alonso's a free agent. Paul Goldschmidt, even though he's way past his prime, is a free agent. None of those guys are on the table. Not happening. The next tier is, it's a little ugly, right? Like, it's not like, oh yes, this is great. Like, it's not great. At the same time, I think there's some guys you can sign that make sense. The first 3 names I put down were Josh Bell, Rhys Hoskins, and Joey Gallo. They're all past they're the best of their career, right? Sure, I get it. But I think there's a world where those guys hit you 20 to 25 homers, and you can maybe flip them at the deadline if they perform better than you expect. And if they perform at expectation, so what? You're spending a year with a guy on your roster who's at least a decent, experienced first baseman.
So I looked on MLB.com to see projected free agent signing salaries, and they projected Hoskins at 2 years, $34 million. You think that's within the White Sox? You think that's way too high?
Actually, sorry, I just looked up. Interesting. Reese Hopkins just accepted his $18 million player option. Fascinating.
Ooh. All
So
right. Well, there you
he
go.
had an 18 million option with this was 3 hours ago. I literally just looked it up to pull this up. I should have checked my research. Apologies for not checking this before, but he just I knew he had a player option with Milwaukee, and I kind of thought he was going to try and get a 2 or 3 year deal instead of taking that player option along the lines of what you said. But 18 million for a year is pretty solid. So I think he is I think he's staying back. I think he's staying in Milwaukee. So that ties up that hole. So I guess it's Reese Hoskins off the table then. So Josh Bell, Joey Gallo, are we not interested at all? Is it, I mean, again, it's not, I wouldn't say it's much of an upgrade over Vaughn, but it's a veteran, maybe a little bit more tradability at the deadline.
I'm really underwhelmed by Joey Gallo. I just the last
Yeah.
thing we need are another 150 strikeouts in the lineup. Um,
Yeah. But he does
um,
walk. That's one thing that the lineup could use.
yeah, that's true. Um, I'm with you. I hope it's Tim Elko for the first half of the season to
Hmm.
see what he can do.
Yeah.
But who knows if he's going to earn that shot in spring training. Josh Bell's kind of
I
interesting.
kind of like Josh Bell. I was going to say
Yeah,
that's kind of the one I like. I think that's the one
one.
that makes the most sense, right? 20 home runs
Yeah.
last year, 725 OPS. It's not a huge upgrade over Vaughn, but it's switch hitting. It's veteran ability. He's been traded the past few years, over a few times, right? I think that's a little more interesting. I think Bell, with the ability to platoon him with a Timelko, if you want to, could make some sense.
Yeah, I just wonder if we just are not convincing ourselves that really Vaughn's going to be back because the alternatives are
Yeah,
not that.
that's You could
Yeah,
definitely be right there. I also think there's a chance they try Miguel Vargas at first. I think, he's not a big dude, so size wise, it's a little bit weird for, traditional first baseman, right? But Vaughn's not a big dude either, frankly. So I think there's a world they try Vargas there because he struggled defensively and because, you do hopefully have a Brian Ramos playing third base. So I think there's a chance. But I also wouldn't be shocked to just see it be Vaughn and potentially some Elko here and there. Like, that could be the plausible situation, right? I mean, I think Ty France is another one. Maybe it's ugly. Wilmer Flores, maybe it's a aside from the top guys, right? It's a really ugly. I mean, Justin Turner is 40 years old, but is better offensively than the rest of those guys. So maybe for just the sake of flipping him at the deadline, but like it's aside from those top few, which are not in the White Sox range, it's a really rough first base class, and I don't think any of those guys are a significant upgrade. I think just for the sake of just being able to move on from Vaughn, maybe you go with one of those guys over a Vaughn. But the reality is, it's not exciting regardless of what happens there.
no, you're right. It's a pretty underwhelming list. I think if they move on from Vaughn and they're forced to go out and pick up someone, I think Josh Bell is the top of the list. I think
Yeah, no,
in
I
terms of
think
productivity and cost.
I think you're right there. Um, so the one guy that was going to Infield next, in terms of just somebody to fill out the infield, somebody to play some second or some third or maybe a shortstop, right? Just somebody to play infield and help kind of ease in all those young guys that we're talking about. The first guy I was going to mention, I'm glad I just looked this up. The very first guy I had on this list also just had an option that was accepted today. It was a club option, but the option was accepted for Brandon Lau, who was my first target, because Brandon Lau is someone who's played some first, he's played some second, and he's played some third. Brandon Lau could be a guy that you could, he's had a lot of injuries over time, but generally he's been productive. But the Rays just picked up his team option. I didn't actually think they would, to be honest, because the Rays are pretty cheap, but they
Right.
did pick up his team option. So Brandon Lau is staying with the Rays, so that takes him out of the possibilities here. But there's still some other guys that I think, make a good amount of sense here, right? I think Whit Merrifield, we've heard for like 3 straight off seasons that could be a White Sox target. It still kind of makes sense. Like it really does. I think Whit Merrifield, you can play him all over the field. I think it's right. It's ugly. It's going to be ugly. No matter what I say for these infielders, it's going to be a little ugly. But at the same time, I do think it makes some sense. I think Jose Iglesias just had this hilarious, crazy run with the Mets where he just became awesome for a few months for no reason really, but cool. Similar like DeYoung thing, right? I feel like you could, whatever, bring back Paul DeYoung. That's on the list. I have Paul DeYoung written down because it worked last year, kind of, right? It didn't do much, but I don't know. Probably not, right? JD Davis, Gio Urshela, potentially Ahmed Rosario is another one. It's it's not a great list, right? I mean, free agent infielders, it's really just it's Gleyber Torres, who I think is priced out for the White Sox. It's Willy Adames, who's priced out. It's Alex Bregman, who's priced out. And then the next kind of tier of Ha-Seong Kim or Eugenio Suarez. Those are the two others that are kind of that second tier of infielders. I don't think either makes sense. And I think those guys are both signing longer term deals too. So it's like beyond those five guys I mentioned, there's nobody else on this second base, shortstop, third base list. So just go with the young guys, right? Like, I mean, you're going to sign someone, right? Like, I don't mind the idea of a Merrifield or a Jose Iglesias or even a Gio Urshela, right? I think those guys are fine, but I don't want to see those guys playing every day necessarily, really.
Well, in terms of Suarez, I definitely do not want to see them commit
Yeah.
more than a year to a third baseman.
Doesn't make sense.
With Colson and Ramos, one of those guys is going to be the third baseman in 26.
I agree. Yeah, I agree.
I tell you, I've always liked Jose Iglesias. I mean, he's just the bat was a big surprise this year, but he's always been solid defensively. Yeah. And one of the things that I worry about, the White Sox amid all their problems, one of them has been defense. The offense sort of people get consumed with that, and rightly so. But the defense has been pretty lousy too, and that's why I'm not 100%. Really sure I want to see Miguel Vargas on the infield. And why I'd like,
right?
I just think at some point you do have to pay attention to the defense. And Iglesias is known for his glove, and he can play all three infield positions.
No, I agree with you. I think it'd be interesting to see. I think that would make some sense. I think Iglesias, you can start at shortstop if you're not ready to make Colson the shortstop, or you're not ready to make Brooks Baldwin the shortstop, right? But he can also allow to shift him to second. He can shift him to third. He can move around. I think that makes a lot of sense. I think, an Ahmed Rosario would kind of be that same type of mold, probably a step below an Iglesias, but a similar type of, veteran guy who can play pretty good defense. He could be at short. He could be at second. He can move over to third even if needed, right? Like, whoever the infielder is that they sign, because I do think they're going to sign one, and it's going to be a bargain veteran for sure. But if whoever they sign, it's going to be someone. It should be someone that can still not take the focus away from all those young infielders, like we keep saying, right? Like the focus is on Colson, Ramos, Baldwin, Vargas. This player is a supplement and to help not overstimulate kind of that growth of those young players, right?
Mm-hmm. And I'm not forgetting any. Is there another infielder who could surprise us in spring training? I kind of couldn't think of anyone.
I mean, not really. I don't think, unless it's it'd have to be a surprise name that popped up, kind of. But I don't really see anybody else from the system at least being in roster contention. So, I think there'll be someone. I think Iglesias makes sense. I think Rosario makes sense. I think Urshela. I mean, I think there's options. Again, none of them are pretty, but these are all guys that could have a good half and be flipped for a single prospect at the deadline and fill up some innings and not put pressure on the young guys early, which is a positive, right?
Right.
Heading to the outfield. I like the outfielders. This is the one positional group where I think the White Sox have the ability to make a legit ad. Will they spend the money to make a legit ad is a whole nother question. Is there plenty of people available that could be like, oh, that's a pretty good addition? There actually is in the outfield, I think. And I do think there's a lot of names that could make a lot of sense to be that starting right fielder. So obviously Juan Soto off the table. Even, Anthony Santander, Teoscar Hernandez, Cody Bellinger, Tyler O'Neill, Jurickson Profar, those are probably all off the table in my eyes. I think Hernandez and Santander both had huge seasons and are going to get paid deservingly for sure. Tyler O'Neill had a big season after being, always having upside, but never really showed it fully until this year, I feel like, or at least let it fully rip this year when he was healthy. Those guys are going to get paid. Cody Bellinger, I think, will probably stick with the Cubs because he has an opt-out clause, but I don't think he's going to get that much money on the market. He'll probably stay. Soto obviously is going to get $600 million. Before we get into these, actually, I'm curious, Jeff, what's your Soto take? You think he's just going to stay in the Yankees, or you think he's going somewhere?
Well, maybe he's the one who doesn't take the most money, but 9 times out of 10, especially with Boris as the agent, they go to the highest bidder, and I don't know. I mean, I don't know how the Yankees. Well, I was going to say I don't know how the Yankees can afford to lose him, but unless they're, Hal Steinbrenner is ready to blow by the tax threshold, if they get Soto, they really can't fill in for Torres at second base. They can't fill in the pitching depth.
Well, there's a chance they'd have to let Cole go too, because Cole's contract has an opt-out right now. So if Cole, basically, I was looking at it this morning, if Cole opts out of his contract, the Yankees can void the opt-out by adding another year on, but the Yankees adding another $36 million onto Cole's contract.
Oof.
I mean, it's already incredibly expensive, right? So we'll see. But I think it's one of the New Yorks. I think either the Mets pull him away for a ton of money or he stays with the Yankees. That's kind of my gauge on it right now. But
Interesting.
in the outfield side, we talked about all these guys that are not realistic. Sorry, White Sox fans. We shouldn't have even brought up Juan Soto because we know that's not happening. But in terms of the viable candidates, right? Michael Conforto was an option for the White Sox. They were negotiating with him a few years ago when he was a free agent. I like it. I think it makes a lot of sense. Going from a Mark Canha. Mark Canha had a pretty good year. He was flipped to the deadline. He had some ups and downs, but has played both corner outfield spots. A Harrison Bader is a guy that is still sneaky pretty young. He's only 31. A guy that, had some pop early in his career, has definitely not had the best year or two, but can play some center field as well. Michael A. Taylor also, who's played a good amount of center field in his career. So someone that you could, if Robert gets traded, either of those guys would make sense to be slot-in guys. They can start in right field. They're plus defenders for sure. And then the one name that I kind of think I like the best of all of them is Max Kepler. The former Twin, a guy that has killed the White Sox over the years. He has been a serious White Sox killer, has dealt with some injuries and has had some ups and downs, but I don't think the Twins are going to pay him. I have a hard time to seeing the Twins paying. I think the Twins have a lot of other things they need to kind of just figure out what their direction is right now, and I don't think they're going to pay Kepler. I could see some big teams being interested in him. He had a down year, though. 682 OPS this year, right? And only played in, I want to say around 100 games or so. He definitely dealt with some injuries as well. I think Kepler could be a really nice buy low, actually. I think he's been someone who, the past few years, the 2023 with the Twins, he had an 816 OPS with 24 home runs. And, in the past, in 2019, he had 36 home runs. He's had some big home run seasons. He's also a guy that is, pretty solid in terms of walking. He's had some higher strikeout rates in the past few years, but has generally been a decently high walk rate guy as well. Kepler's someone who, is a veteran. He's not coming off his best season, but I think a buy low on Kepler, especially as a lefty right fielder, could make a lot of sense.
You know what? When you sent me the list, he was my number one choice and Bader was my number two choice.
Yeah, I like Bader as well.
And because one of the reasons I like both of them is they both have great gloves. They can both bring the defense to right field that we've been missing forever.
Yep, 100%.
And you're right. And Kepler is a lefty, and they both have had good offensive years in the past.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of those options. So I think Conforto would still be okay. I mean, that's not quite as good defensively for sure, but Conforto had a pretty decent season offensively at the plate, so I think he could bring some degree of consistent offense, right, to that position. I think any of those guys would be great. I hope that they don't just roll out with someone and just go with, I just hope it's not like a Kevin Pillar or like a, Jason Hayward at 35 years old or Randall Grichuk or one of those like that. It could be. I know you just rolled your eyes so much there, but like it could be. And I hope they just actually go for one of those mid-tier guys that could have some upside in a Kepler, in a Bader, in a Conforto, right? Like just don't go with one of the bargain hunting guys because at that point it's like just let Fletcher play or let Colas play if you're going to go with one of the guys that has so little value in my opinion. At least spend the money on one of the middle tier outfielders in my view. And
with Benintendi in left, you need a bit of a power bat in right. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, no, 100%. So I think a lot of those names make sense. I think this is the one position of any where unless you're getting a Heston Kjerstad or someone along those lines in a crochet trade, right? Unless you're getting a high end outfield prospect, you need to just sign someone that can at least be a league average outfielder to play right field.
Yeah, I agree. Though I know we're going to talk about trade candidates later, but God, I just keep thinking the Dodgers need a couple of inexpensive starting pitchers. And wouldn't it be great?
They do, but it's insane. They don't need it. Look at what they just did in the playoffs with 3 starters, and they have half
the guys. Look at all the guys who are not going to be back next year because
a lot are going to be back next year. A lot of those guys that got hurt are going to be back next year. That's the thing. Stone's going to be back, and there's.
I think Stone's.
Did he get TJ?
Yeah.
Oh, did he really? Wow, I know. River Ryan had TJ. But you're getting you should be getting a Dustin May back. You should be getting a Tony Gonsolin back. Hope they're probably going to they're going to re-sign Kershaw after that parade today. Kershaw's not going anywhere. You could be right. I get it.
Well, I was just going to say, hey, this guy is cheap. Do you want him? Give us Zaire Hope in right field, right? I mean, that's a
he's not ready. He's not ready quite yet. He's going to be a year or two out still, but yeah. No,
I mean,
even Dalton Rushing, frankly, they moved Dalton Rushing to the outfield last year. Their top catching prospect. They started playing him in the outfield last year because they wanted him to be in their major league team next year, right? Like, yeah, he's a top 50 prospect, but like, if you want Garrett Crochet, we'll take Dalton Rushing to play right field.
yeah,
It's like
yeah.
it's hard to gauge, but whatever way it happens, you got to find someone to start in right field that's not currently on the roster and not in the organization right now, because I don't
Yeah.
think anybody in the organization right now is should be getting a full-time spot in the outfield.
And I know it's impossible. I know there's a less than 1% chance that they would go out and spend big money. But the truth is, they've got hardly any money on the books for next year, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's insanely low.
None.
They
Yeah.
could afford $45 million a year for
100%.
Soto. I mean,
Well,
it would,
don't
huh?
even say that, Jeff. You can't give people hope
I
like
know,
that.
or even Teoscar, for what,
They
25
could,
or whatever.
they could,
They
they
could
could, but they
afford
won't.
that so easily, and you've got that cornerstone bat in your lineup.
But
Yeah, I know.
given the status of the team, I don't see it happening, unfortunately.
I know. Yeah.
We will wrap there. There is a few DHs. I am a big fan of not signing a DH. I think signing a DH is silly. The one guy I'd keep an eye on is Jock Peterson, just because I think Jock could still play a little bit of right field, and Jock did have a really good season hitting wise, so I think there's a chance that Jock Peterson could be in play for a right field DH kind of platoon spot. If you want to add some power, that's the one last name I wanted to mention there. But generally, like, it's not going to be great, but I think it can go a long way to sign a few of these guys we mentioned and at least supplement all the young guys with 3 or 4 guys you feel pretty good about heading into next year.
Yeah. I'm just sitting here thinking about Juan Soto and a White Sox. Really, I mean, think about
No,
what
no, no.
attendance would double. I
Yeah,
mean,
but
attendance would double. You'd get a much better TV deal. I mean,
I
so many reasons that it makes sense. But of course, we know it's a less than 1% chance. I'll give it up.
I
But it makes
I love
so much
I
sense.
love I love the sense that you're trying to make there. It's not gonna happen, but I do love the thought there.
All right, we'll end on that
All
one
right.
then.
We'll end on that. That's perfect. We will be back. You're going on a trip, so I will not see you for a little while, but we will be back in 2 weeks. I'll probably have some more interviews out for those listening. I just did a Sean Burke interview this week. That was really fun listening to Sean Burke talk about his first stint of big league ball. He's excited. He's fired up. I think a lot of the young guys are really excited for this next era and are really hoping to be part of this next generation of White Sox baseball, right? So Sean Burke interview, Raku Nishida and Riley Gowan's interview was a week ago or a week and a half ago at this point. Both those interviews are up on the Future Sox feed. Definitely check those out. They were both a lot of fun. Hopefully gonna have some more interviews coming up with a variety of prospects. But until next time, we will talk to you on the Future Sox Roundup later.